Welcome to this parallel session. It's my pleasure to introduce the speakers that we have for this session. We have three distinguished speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Hold on for a second, Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, Assistant Professor of Economics at the University of Oran in Algeria. She will be speaking about corruption, a brutal enemy of economic diversification in MENA oil exporters. So that will be our first speaker. Our second speaker will be Dr. Sayyid Mohammed Zivi. I hope I'm doing the pronunciation correct, at the Université Clermont Auvergne École d'Économie in France, and he will be speaking about the economic, social, and institutional determinants of internal conflict in fragile states. Our third speaker is Dr. Ibrahim Al-Nafra, from Damascus University in Syria. He will be speaking on the paper with the title of Testing the External Shock Narrative of the Conflict on Transition Towards Knowledge Economy in Syria. I look forward very much to having myself and my co-discussant, Dr. Vladimir Hasni. Ourselves are from ESQA. Myself, I'm the team leader of the poverty group in ESQA. Also, Dr. Vladimir is with me. He's also with the poverty and inequality team, and we are very much looking forward to have this interactive discussion. If I may ask the participants, if they have questions, to please use the Q&A text box, so that they can put questions forward for everybody. And let's begin with the first speaker for 10 to 15 minutes. And the way that we'll proceed is by having the speakers present the papers. And then Dr. Vlad and myself will give some discussant comments and then open the floor for discussion. Dr. Ibrahim, the floor is yours for 10 to 15 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. I would like to thank the organizing committee for inviting me to participate in this great conference. Today, I present a paper entitled Corruption, a Brutal Enemy of Economic Diversification in MENA oil exporters. When oil prices plunged from mid-2014 to early 2016 and again in March 2020, most MENA oil exporters sighed beneath an intolerable burden of undiversified export base and quickly depleting foreign exchange reserves, and bemoaned not strategically benefiting from the previous huge leap in oil prices that had a profound impact on the scourging economic diversification away from the oil sector. And the question of why some oil-rich countries succeeded in diversifying their economies, why most MENA exporters failed to do so, has attracted considerable interest. For example, some successful diversifiers like Canada, Norway, and Malaysia showed a tremendous commitment to finally get rid of heavy dependence on oil revenues and became role models and trendsetters for oil-cursed countries that aspire in some way to an expanded and diversified export base. And these countries share a main commonality, which is a very low level of corruption. Some recent studies have examined whether corruption prevents economic diversification, but they didn't empirically compare diversification experience of successful diversifiers to that of oil exporting countries that fail to diversify their export base. So far, none of these studies has been able to determine the rate of improvement in economic diversification if unsuccessful diversifiers will have control of corruption scores similar to that of successful diversifiers. Therefore, the present paper revisits the relationship between control of corruption and economic diversification in MENA oil exporters and three successful diversifiers, and addresses the mentioned shortcoming for providing more useful and reliable information that may help in reorientating the focus towards a wider anti-corruption strategy in the journey of stimulating economic diversification. And the present paper is divided into the following 5 sections. And now I'll move on to the theoretical and empirical view on economic diversification and corruption. The windfall gains that arise from oil promote rent-seeking behavior on the part of corrupt public officials who tend to be de facto distributive clients of the state, use oil rents to reward their supporters, buy off or repress their politically influential opponents, turn a blind eye to productive activities, and spend less on education job programs for the unemployed. And as a result, create complications and impose artificial limitations on any attempt to diversify revenue sources beyond oil production. So it is pervasive corruption that allows for the continuity of the rich but poor irony in most mineral exporters. Because the combination of oil rents and pervasive corruption downplays the importance of seeking innovation and passing effective laws for protecting the intellectual property, and creates an insulating layer between the income generated by oil sales and the practical ways of financing economic diversification. And the relevant question here is how Canada, Norway, and Malaysia managed to diversify away from oil and develop highly productive non-resource sectors, while most mineral exporters have failed to do so. In fact, Canada, Norway, and Malaysia are characterized by low levels of corruption, not at the same time oil-rich countries with high levels of non-oil exports. And these countries had 2 important things in common. They had leaders who ensured that oil wealth benefited the large majority of the population, and political leaders that are being frugal and accountable to the people. Thus, these countries were able to translate the oil wealth into a well-diversified export base. They succeeded in diversifying or in developing a wide range of manufacturing activities, increasing national productivity, and enacting good economic policies that are conducive to export diversification. And for the empirical analysis, our modified panel data model is as follows. So Davies economic diversification, CC stands for control of corruption, and X represents a set of other explanatory variables. And this study uses variables pertaining to IRNs, economic freedom, human development index, patent application rate, private sector credit, and political stability as control variables. And the best way to address the problems of endogeneity is to use the outline of bond difference GMM estimator, which excludes the unobserved firm effects by first differentiating using appropriately lagged values of endogenous variables as instruments. As shown in column A, control of corruption displays a statistically significant negative impact on economic diversification. In other words, higher control of corruption leads to more diversification, since a high diversification score indicates a low level of economic diversification. Furthermore, IRNs lead to poor economic diversification. In other words, IRN leave no room for investing in the other non-oil sectors like the agricultural sector, the industrial sector, and services sectors in mineral exports. As shown in columns A and C, the multiplicative interaction term between control of corruption and IRNs yields a statistically significant negative coefficient at the 1% level of significance, implying that the combined effect of control of corruption, IRNs, is effective in boosting economic diversification in mineral exporters in the peer group of countries. Furthermore, columns B and D show that human development index, patent application rate, private sector credit, and political stability are effective in boosting economic diversification in both groups of countries. But these explanatory variables are more statistically significant in the peer group of countries than in mineral exporters. In order to reveal how much the level of economic diversification will increase if mineral exporters will have control of corruption scores similar to that of a successful diversifier like Canada, I estimated 2 models before and after replacing mineral exporters' control of corruption scores with those of Canada using the outline of bond difference GMM estimator. So the rate of improvement in economic diversification brought by this replacement is 0.53%. So closing the control of corruption gap determines how quickly mineral exporters can promote economic diversification. and the Sargan-Hansen test of over-identifying restrictions and the Allen-Aban test of second or series correlation show that our instruments are valid and the results of our estimates are consistent. In order to, the following table shows how much MENA exporters need to increase their control of corruption scores to catch up with those of Canada in order to accelerate the process of economic diversification. And column B reveals that non-GCC MENA exporters must exert much more effort compared to GCC countries in order to catch up with Canada's control of corruption scores here. Furthermore, non-GCC MENA exporters must first address the serious problem of instability, because the more unstable the environment is, the more corruption becomes extremely difficult to control and deal with. And finally, as a conclusion, it can be said that a remarkably open, corruption-free environment needs a strong collaborative partnership between government, civil society, and the private sector on anti-corruption issues. And this collaboration must be backed by a fair and impartial judicial system for enforcement and effective checks and balances that reduce opportunities for corruption. Furthermore, an anti-corruption campaign can only succeed if it is made part of the larger question of democracy. Therefore, most MENA exporters need to address their democratic shortcomings by giving greater say back to citizens, expanding citizen participation, especially at the local level, helping maintain an informed citizenry, and modernizing their constitutions, because democracy is a panacea not only for corruption, but also for the concentration in economic activity in a few sectors. It is also necessary to enhance capacity building, encourage innovation, ease access to credit for the private sector, as this is a powerful toolkit for these governments to accelerate or speed up the process of economic diversification. I think I'm gonna leave with that. Thank you so much for your listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siham. It's a very intriguing idea that control of corruption would lead to the economic diversification pattern, and I think that you presented an argument here with regards to the GCC countries that we will, I'm sure, be interesting to discuss further. But as I said, we will go back to the questions and answers at a later stage. And I now would like to turn the floor to our second speaker, Dr. Syed Muhammad. And I'm assuming, Dr. Syed, that you will be presenting this by yourself, not the co-author Marie.
No, I will present the paper.
Exactly, and you'll be speaking to us on economic and social institutional determinants of internal conflict in fragile states. So the floor is yours for 15 minutes, and I turn this, or I should say, the screen is yours for 15 minutes, and I'm turning it over to you now. Go ahead.
Hello everyone, I'm Syed Muhammad Rizvi, PhD student at University Clermont-Auvergne in France. Today I will present my research paper, Economic, Social and Institutional Determinants of Domestic Conflict in Fragile States.
Dr. Syed, may I, sorry to interrupt, but may I ask you to speak closer to the mic, because you're
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
This is much better. Sorry about that, but this is much better. Over to you.
So today I will present my research paper, Economic, Social and Institutional Determinant of Domestic Conflict in Fragile States. My co-author for this research paper is Dr. Marianne Wegenzones. So why we chose conflict as a variable of interest? According to the Uppsala Conflict Data Program, worldwide conflict has increased from 33 state-based conflict in 2006 to more than 50 state-based conflict in 2018. In addition to the human suffering, civil strife causes considerable damage to economies due to its negative effect on infrastructure, public spending, political stability, FDI, trade and growth. Conflict also have a destabilizing effect on neighboring countries, with political instability in a country threatening the stability of the entire region. And World Bank report in fragile states in 2018 conclude that while extreme poverty is declining worldwide, it is increasing in fragile countries affected by conflicts. And if left unchecked, nearly half of the world's poor will live in fragile countries facing conflict situations by 2030. And so the different theories on why people chose conflict or on the onset of conflict in different countries. So there's a rational choice theory. The rational behavior implies that individuals perform a cost and benefit analysis before taking actions. Gary Becker in 1968 argues that individuals commit a crime if the expected benefits outweigh the costs. In the case of conflict, the expected benefits of violence include a redistribution of power and wealth. The costs include a reduction in resources and sanctions. Another explanation of the causes of conflict lies in Caruso and Schneider's theory of emissary modernization, which implies that conflict can arise even in the presence of economic growth. Economic growth can change the distribution of wealth in a country, with some groups losing out, and this can lead to grievances which can be used by the terrorist organizations. And then there is a theory of supreme values by Bernholz in 2004. He describes the ideological content of certain conflicts through the concepts of supreme values. These values refer to one or more objectives that are preferred to all others, and whose realization comes before any other value. uh, Here for the data methodology, a dependent variable is annual conflict-based incidents as proxy for internal conflict from global terrorism database. For our empirical analysis, we define conflict as the threatened or actual use of illegal force and violence by a non-state actor to attain a political, economic, religious, or social goal through fear, coercion, or intimidation. As for this research paper, our focus is only on domestic conflicts. So following Anders et al. Of 2011, we isolated domestic incidents from transnational incidents by eliminating events where the nationality of one of the victims was different from the country where the incident occurred. The time period for the annual data is from 2004 to 2017. Okay, for explanatory variable, we took GDP per capita as proxy for income and wealth from WDI. For effective judiciary as a proxy for deterrence, we took time for enforcing contracts from the doing business database. We hypothesized that if the court are not efficient in making timely decisions, the punishment will not deliver general desired deterrence effect. Education and human capital as proxy for human development. For our analysis, we took two proxies for human development: the average number of years of schooling of population aged 25 or older from the United Nations Development Program, and the second one is from the Human Capital Index from the Penn World Table. We also took trade openness as proxy for economic reforms, and also log of population from WDI. And we took democratic accountability as proxy for democracy from ICRG. The equations used to study the determinants of conflict in fragile states are, these are the equations. The only difference between these two equations is the two proxy for human capital. So in these equations, conflict is the conf is the count data variable for measuring conflict, GTPC, the logarithm of real GDP per capita, EGUM, the average years of education, H, the human capital index from Penn World Table, open, the indicator of trade openness, POP, the logarithm of population, contracts, the proxy for judicial effectiveness, and demo, the democratic variable. We select 58 fragile countries from Fund for Peace database, for which the index was above 70 for the analysis, which corresponds to a high degree of fragility. We analyzed the development of conflict activities from 2004 to 2017 for 4 different groups. Total sample of fragile countries: Islamic fragile states, states affected by major conflicts, fragile countries with more than one important religion. Since we have the annual number of conflict-based domestic incidents from the Global Terrorism Database, okay. Since we have the annual number of conflict-based domestic incidents from the Global Terrorism Database as proxy for violence, this implies that our dependent variable is a non-negative integer. It's a count data. So we used a fixed effect Poisson regression with robust standard errors to address the issues related to count data. To address the possible endogeneity and reverse causality issues underlying a regression, we also estimate our initial specifications using instrumental variable Poisson estimator. Okay, these are the tables. Table 1 is for the total fragile countries. Table 2 is for the Muslim fragile countries. Table 3 is for the fragile countries affected by major conflicts, and table 4 is fragile countries with more than one main religion. So for almost all of our specifications and our groups of countries, increase in income is negatively impacting the domestic conflict. Here you see here it's LGDPC has a negative impact for all our groups. The results indicate that when poverty is high, disadvantaged people can develop grievances against their government. In this case, the use of violence is more likely since the opportunity cost of illegal force and the cost of recruiting rebels are low. Our results indicate that improving incomes does seem to be a variable on which governments can play to reduce violence in their country. The relationship of the conflict variable with that of income, while relatively stable in most of our samples, seems stronger in countries with more than one main religion. And for our results also indicate that another way to reduce conflict in fragile countries could be to improve institutions. So here the variable contracts, it has a positive relationship which shows that the more time a court takes to decide the fate of a criminal, the more violence there will be. So if the legal system punishes in a timely manner, the population will be reluctant to resort to violence and rebels will be reluctant to continue the conflict. The results are more diverse for the judicial system. The improvement in the efficiency of justice is more correlated with the decrease in violence in Muslim states and countries with more than one main religion than in the other groups. Our results show positive impact of trade openness on conflict for the instrumental variable specifications. So for a trade liberalization whose effect on violence seems stronger in countries with more than one main religion. So we believe that our results indicate that the trade liberalization seems to be perceived more as a threat of loss of income or of worsening inequalities than as an opportunity for improving prospects and income of population. Our findings also indicate that education in fragile countries may not translate into an opportunity to improve living conditions or as a mean of strengthening critical thinking against terrorism. In a state with adverse social, economic, and political conditions, education can increase frustration if the situation of educated people does not improve, especially since they are more aware of the limits of their governments. For the four groups of countries, the differences in estimated coefficients are not very significant. They are insignificant for our four specification in the Muslim countries, but other than that, they have the positive impact for all other specifications. For democratic accountability, the positive sign means that when fragile countries go from authoritarianism to democracy, they can face more civil unrest. Our results indicate that democratic experiences do not seem to be a source of increased violence in most of our fragile countries, except in the case of countries affected by major conflict. Like here, they have a positive significant sign. Okay, so we conclude that we use fixed effect Poisson regression with robust standard errors and lagged independent. Sorry, here it's not lagged independent variable. I didn't change. It's the IV instrumental variable. So to study the social, economic, and institutional determinants of conflict in fragile states, we show that low incomes are positively associated with civil conflict. We also conclude that weak institutions are also positively correlated with the violence in our samples of fragile countries. This general pattern works well for most of our country groups, but some groups experience somewhat different situations. We suggest that improving people's standard of living could bear fruit in most fragile countries. We also suggest that conflict can be mitigated in fragile states through improving the efficiency of the justice system and strict application of law and order. We also suggest that fragile states would probably first have to improve the social, economic, and institutional conditions of their population before they can benefit from political reforms and education. Thank you so much for listening to me.
Thank you, Dr. Sayed. Very interesting presentation, and clearly this speaks to the heart of our session today on the relationship between conflict and its sources, the driving sources, and the institutional variables in particular. So I think you made the narrative clear that conflict is dependent on a variety of variables: income, the strength and dependence of the judiciary, your level of human development, trade, and accountability. I think your conclusions are also in line with what we would expect. But let me, before we go into the discussion of the methodology and some of these very intriguing issues, turn the floor to our last speaker from Damascus University, Dr. Ibrahim.
Yes.
And the screen is yours for, again, 15 minutes to speak about testing the external shock narrative of the conflict on transition towards a knowledge economy in Syria. Your paper, which is co-authored with Dr. Suleiman Mousili, but I'm assuming that you will be presenting on his behalf as well, right?
Yes, I will. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for giving us such opportunity to present our work in this conference. Our research is titled Testing the External Shock Narrative of Conflict. I would like to emphasize on the importance of this study by answering the question why this study is important. This study contributes to the existing literature by expanding the boundaries of external shock studies beyond the macroeconomics. Also, it explores a new domain of external shock narrative in the context of knowledge-based economy building. So what do we know and what we don't know about these topics? We know that the narrative of external shocks in the literature in general and in Arab country studies in particular is dominant. And also we know that the previous studies emphasize on the negative impact of the political instability as a proxy of external shock on the innovation-related activities. Regarding what we don't know, and that are the main question of our study, is that what is the impact of external and internal shocks on transition process toward knowledge-based economy in Syria? And is the external shocks narrative valid to explain the Syrian delay in the transition toward a knowledge-based economy? Regarding the objective of our study, we endeavor to investigate the impact of external and internal shocks on the transition process toward knowledge-based economy, and investigate the relationship between external shocks and internal shocks and their impact on the transition process toward knowledge-based economy in Syria. And lastly, determine which type of shocks are the most obstructing the transition toward knowledge-based economy in Syria. We started our study with two hypotheses. The first hypothesis that external shocks in Syria have no significant impact on transition process toward knowledge-based economy. The second hypothesis is that there are no differences in the impact of external and internal shocks on transitions to process toward knowledge-based economy in Syria. Regarding the existing literature in this topics, prior literature focuses on the impact of different types of external shocks on developing economics indicators. Those external shocks include many types or different types of shocks, such as interest rate and exchange rate shocks, monetary shocks, and oil price shocks, and other type of shocks. It's clearly from studying the existing literature that most studies are related to macroeconomic shocks. Regarding the studies that investigate the relationship between political instability and innovation activities, several channels are suggested in the literature to describe how political instability would affect a country's innovation and technological activities, and consequently impairs its transition process to knowledge-based economy. For example, the first channel is when entrepreneurs will escape in stable country because they will not be able to run businesses in them. Second channel is trust and certainty that are crucial for a triple helix model to flourish in the economy, where political instability creates an atmosphere of mistrust between essential actors and units of innovation, and both formal and informal institutions, which undermine innovation and causes an innovation system failure. Third channel is the uncertainty caused by political instability that discourages both local and foreign investors from making investment, where several studies suggest that political instability reduces FDI inflows and human capital development, which consequently impair innovation rates and investments. Fourth and last channel is the shift in resources from R&D investment to unproductive cost and military expenditures in politically unstable country would hinder their efforts in transition to a knowledge economies. Regarding the Arab country studies in the field of testing or investigating external shocks, interestingly, that the narrative of external shocks in the literature in general and in Arab country study in particular is dominant, and this dominance makes the validity of this narrative questionable. There are several studies in the Arab country in which the external narrative has a dominant position. Expectedly, oil price shocks significantly affect GDP, for example, and trade balances of GCC country, for example. In addition, the spirit of ICT in Arab country, which constitutes a pillar for knowledge-based economy, disrupt the political economic environment. And as I mentioned by some scholars that calls the internet technology as in Arab world as a double-edged sword, because it upgrades the economy in one hand and disrupt the political system in other hand. So in the existing literature, there are many other studies that explain the failure in the economic, social, and political Arab system by internal shocks and factors. Some studies attribute the political instability of the so-called Arab Spring to social instability caused by the failure in job creation and economic diversification. Also, it's obvious that the previous external shocks studies have been limited to the analysis and measurement of the impact of external shocks on macroeconomic indicator. However, in our the impact of external, but also to other indicators associated with the transition process toward knowledge-based economy. To the best of our knowledge, no previous study have examined or analyzed the impact of external or internal shocks on the transition process toward a knowledge-based economy. Therefore, we attempt to investigate the impact of external and internal shocks on the transition process toward knowledge-based economy. Regarding our data and methodology, this study includes data of basic knowledge economy indicator available from 2000 to 2018. In light of the scarcity of data about knowledge economy in Syria, 3 variables were used as a proxy for 3 dimensions of knowledge-based economy. First, we have education index as a proxy of human capital building. Second, the number of patent application as a proxy of innovation activities. Third, the number of trademarks as a proxy of commercialization of knowledge and innovation. These 3 variables were aggregated by taking their average standardized value to produce one dependent variable representing a proxy for a knowledge economy in Syria. Regarding the variables of shocks, internal and external, for example, we divided the history of economic Syria into 2 periods where the Syrian economy has witnessed a number of events in the period prior to 2011. First, the Syrian economy witnessed a quick transition from a centrally planned economy to a social market economy. Therefore, we divided shocks that disrupt the Syrian economy into 2 groups. First group is internal shocks, which include the internal liberal policy shock since 2005 and the internal shock of conflict since 2011. The second group of shocks is the external shock, represent the Arab Spring in Arab country that began in 2010. A set of dummy variables were created to present the internal and external shocks. In order to analyze the impact of internal and external shocks on the knowledge economy in Syria, a structural VAR model was used. First, the general specification of the SVAR model is shown in the slide, where Y represent the endogenous variable of study, which include in our study knowledge economy, internal policy shock, internal conflict shock, and external conflict shock. Also, we have error terms, which is a vector of structural shocks that is identically disrupted. L, the number of lags, A is a coefficient matrix, and B is the contemporaneous interaction matrix. Also, the matrix of structural shocks supposed to be orthogonal, where sigma error terms supposed to equal unity and to have a unitary variances to make it possible to isolate the effect of shocks from each other. Furthermore, the absence of effect of internal shocks on external shocks can be represented as zeros in the A matrix. Second, we imposed a set of restrictions in the SVAR model. We imposed short-run and long-run restrictions. Restrictions were imposed on the relationship between variables based on the economic theory. Therefore, the short-run form of the SVAR model can be shown in the slide, where the liberal policy adopted in 2005 in Syria doesn't show a significant effect on the internal conflict. Therefore, we imposed restriction on this relationship in the short-run matrix. Also, we restricted the impact of the external conflict shock on the internal policy shock, since the shift in policy happened before the Arab Spring. Regarding the long-run form of the SVAR model, we activated the impact of internal liberal policy shock on the internal conflict and knowledge economy, since 5 to 10 years are enough to evaluate the effect of this shock on both knowledge economy and internal conflict. In order to perform the SVAR analysis, also there is a set of assumptions that must be fulfilled. First, for example, stationarity test, where all variables should be stationary at the first differences as shown in the table on the slide. Second, the optimal lag selection, where various criteria were used to choose the optimal lag. The result in table show that the second lag is the optimal lag according to different criteria. Third, we test the stability of the model by conducting the inverse root of the autoregression characteristic polynomial. The results shown in the figure indicate the stability of the model and the reliability of the coefficients. Fourth and finally, we test the VAR residual serial correlation. The result in the slide in the table shows that indicate that the residuals of the model are not serially correlated. After checking all requirements of SVAR, we built our model for both short and long run, and the result in the table show that there is a significant negative relationship between the internal and external shocks and the knowledge economy variable. The results also show that there is a positive relationship between the external shock and the internal conflict shock. However, this relationship isn't significant, indicating that the external shock in the Arab country participated in accelerating the conflict in Syria in the short run, but not that significant. To identify the impact path of shocks on the knowledge economy in the short run, we analyzed the impulse response of the knowledge economy to all shocks. The results show that the internal liberal policy shock in Syria contributed to an increase in the knowledge economy in the first 2 years, but it quickly reverted to a negative, especially in the 5th year of adoption of policy in 2010. This negative impact of liberal policy on the knowledge economy is due to the absence of a national economic strategy aiming at transforming the Syrian economy toward a knowledge economy. And this is confirmed by the absence of a national strategy for science, technology, and innovation until late 2019. As to the impact of external conflict shock in the Arab country on the knowledge economy, the results in the slide show that the knowledge economy was affected by the external shock after 2 years of the conflict in the Arab country, 2012, where we note a significant decline after the 2nd year. It should be noted that after the 5th year of external conflict in the Arab country, 2015, where the situation in those countries had begun to stabilize and the political instability in them has decreased, the impact of the external shock has significantly disappeared in the 9th year. Regarding the impact of internal conflict on the knowledge economy, the internal conflict has had a direct impact on the knowledge economy only at the beginning of the 3rd year of conflict, as shown in the slide. In sum, the accumulative impact of internal and external shocks on knowledge economy was negative at the first 2 years, except the internal liberal policy shock that have positively influenced the first 2 years to revert in the following years, as the 3 figures in this slide illustrate. The result of The short-run SVAR model also showed that the external shock affected the internal conflict in the first 2 years, as shown in the slide, and then its impact decreased over time. This is due to the way the dynamics of the conflict in Syria have evolved afterward. In order to determine the contribution of each shock to the interpretation of variances in the knowledge economy variable, we have conducted a variances decomposition analysis of the short-run impact of shocks, which are shown in the table on the slide. The result in table show that the external conflict shock had the highest explanatory power in the short run of 10 years, with 48% of the variances in the knowledge economy, whereas the internal policy shock and the internal conflict shock contribute toward explaining only 26.9% and 18.1% of the variances of the knowledge economy, respectively. These results indicate that in the short run, external shocks play a more important role than internal shocks in interpreting changes in the knowledge economy in Syria. This can be explained by 2 reasons. First, the nature of the knowledge economy indicators that respond rapidly to external changes, since the innovation activity are highly correlated with external factors. Second, the delay in activating the impact of internal shocks. To analyze the nature of long-run relationship between shocks and knowledge economy, also we have built a long-run SVAR model after releasing the restrictions of the internal policy shocks impact on the internal conflict shocks. And the result in table show that there is a significant negative impact of the internal policy shock and internal conflict on the knowledge economy. The results also show that the internal liberal policy shock has a positive relationship with the internal conflict. On the other hand, the results show that the external shock doesn't have a significant impact on the internal conflict or the knowledge economy on the long run. This can be explained by the fact that the mechanisms of the internal conflict started to revolutionize itself with internal accumulated factors due to the way in which the conflict developed over time. Similarly, we analyze the impulse response of knowledge economy to all shocks on the long run. For example, in this slide, the internal liberal policy shock in Syria increased the variances of the knowledge economy in the first 2 years. However, after that, it affected the knowledge economy negatively. This indicates that liberal policies that were supposed to expand the prospects of knowledge-intensive activity that require a certain level of economic liberalism and openness haven't been properly implemented. This has adversely affected the performance of the key indicators of the knowledge economy in Syria. Also, regarding the long-run impact of external shock, the results shown in the slide indicate that the negative impact lasts for 3 years before becoming non-significant in the long run. Here, it should be noted that the decreasing long-run impact of external shock on the knowledge economy is due to the increase in the impact of internal shocks on the knowledge economy compared to external shock. Also, a figure in this slide shows that the impact of internal conflict on the knowledge economy, where the results show that the internal conflict shock had a negative significant impact on the knowledge economy in the first 4 years. This effect lasted until the end of the 9th year of the conflict. Regarding the impact of both internal policy shock and external shock on the internal conflict in Syria, figure in the slide show that impact of internal policy shock affect the internal conflict more than the external shock in the long run. This can be explained by 2 reasons: the nature of the Syrian conflict, which has taken an international dimension, and the unstable and unstudied liberal policy that widened social polarization and marginalized a huge fraction of the society, leading to the erosion of its human capital. Also, the result of the variance decomposition of knowledge economy on the long run show that on the long run, the internal shocks, whether the internal policy shock or internal conflict shock, have the largest influence in knowledge economy and contribute to explaining the variances of the knowledge economy in Syria by 56.4% and 26.9% respectively. On the other hand, external shock explains only 7.6% of the variances of the knowledge economy. Consequently, it can be concluded that the narrative of external shocks and their impact on knowledge economy in Syria are valid only in the short run. In the long run, however, the narrative of external shock cannot provide a comprehensive explanation of the changes in the knowledge economy, and internal shocks, whether associated with political and security instability or those associated with the poorly implemented national economic policies, are the ones that have the greatest impact on the process of building and transitioning toward the knowledge economy in the long run in Syria. In the long run, internal conflict in Syria is more determined by internal factors than by external shocks. This is because of the way in which the dynamics of the conflict were evolved and to the type of economic policy adopted in the conflict period. We argue that limiting the explanation of the failure in transitioning toward knowledge-based economy to external shocks alone doesn't reflect reality. Based on the above results, it can be argued that building national policy for innovation, technology, and science as well as achieving a political settlement together with the agreement on the identity of national economy within the framework of a clear and comprehensive strategy are essential steps to build a knowledge-based economy in post-conflict Syria. Moreover, all narratives that link the failure of the process of building or transition toward the knowledge economy merely to external shocks or external factors are unreliable. Therefore, taking the internal shocks into account, especially in countries that suffer from political and social instability and the fluctuating national policy, is a fundamental step toward understanding reality and identifying the shortcomings in the system. This step is important to orient national innovation policy toward accelerating the process of building a knowledge-based economy in a country that is struggling to put an end to the spiral of the conflict. Thank you for listening, and any question or comments are welcome.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim. You have presented a very forceful argument here with basically the story that the economic policies that preceded and took place after the conflict are basically the ones that are responsible for the outbreak of the conflict and the failure of Syria to transition to a knowledge-based economy. Very interesting argument, and I'm sure that it will be the subject of much discussion. But before turning the floor to the discussion, perhaps myself and Vladimir, and I'm also pleased to see that we have with us Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, whose expertise on issues related to conflict and institution is well known to everybody. So also, I'm sure he would like very much to contribute to the discussion. So let me start maybe, since we have some time, taking one paper at a time. And if I might ask Vladimir, if you would like to share the screen of the comments that you have. So let's take them one paper at a time. And yes, Dr. Seham, I will focus mainly on the conceptual issues, and I will leave the methodological ones to Dr. Vladimir. So Dr. Seham's argument is very simple as far as I understand. You know, if you work on your control of corruption, countries, oil-rich countries in the MENA will have a much better chance to achieve economic diversification, and that's because control of corruption will limit rent-seeking behavior, and it will allow and induce a process of economic diversification, such as we've seen in Canada, Malaysia, Norway, and other diversified countries. So basically, it's that key issue out of all of the governance factors. It's the control of corruption. That's how I read the argument, at least. That will lead to economic diversification. But I find the story somehow problematic, Dr. Seham, from, first of all, a historical point of view. Because actually, well, some people would argue, if you were to look at, for example, the writings of Alice Amsden, Chang, Lal, others, when they actually went to analyze the economic diversification experiences of many East Asian countries in particular, I mean, Canada and Norway are different, and I will get to them in a moment. They actually, and actually this was a critique by the liberal, the trade economists in particular, and I will go back to, I think when the Asian crisis happened, Alan Greenspan's main comment was that, well, we told you so. These economies were corrupt. They were crony capitalists. So crony capitalists, what does that mean? It basically means that you are favoring some groups over others. You are deliberately leading the economy. You're deliberately actually giving extra incentives, call them rents, if you will, to some people. But in order for them to diversify, in order for them to increase their value added in the economy. So it's the job of the planner, therefore, to use, if you will, what the Western economists might call corruption, in order to give an incentive for the chaebols in Korea so that they can build a ship in building industry, for example, and that they can develop their competitive advantage. So this is a counter argument that may actually be interesting to look at. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that theoretically, the relationship between corruption per se and economic diversification in your argument is not clear why you would have this causal relationship. Now that's one issue. And the other issue when it comes to Norway and Canada versus maybe not so much Malaysia, but versus countries in the MENA is the initial conditions. The human development and particularly the education, the level of education that you had, and the institutional strength, which is different than corruption per se, but the institutional strength, the other measures of the strength of your public institutions. And perhaps you can measure that by the government effectiveness index of the World Bank, perhaps, which measures things like the quality of public service delivery, the quality of your infrastructure, the quality of your health and education systems. That is perhaps what was different when you had countries like Norway when they discovered the oil. Therefore, they had a system of public accountability. They had already in places a system of institutional strength that made it easier to do diversification. So that would be my, at the conceptual level, my comments with regards to the first paper. Dr. Said's paper, I very much like your paper. Again, I think your choice of the dependent variable for me was key. The fact that you chose observational indicators of the conflict and not the ones that are based on expert opinion, I think was key. And I like that very much. In fact, I'm also working on a paper with Dr. Shahir and Zaki and others in which we're trying to do the same, in which we're trying to move away from perception-based indicators of conflict to more objective incident-based. But that then takes you into a whole different discussion. Did you control for the frequency of the events and the intensity of that? And it wasn't clearly to me that you have done so. Another issue that I think maybe Vlad can speak to is the issue of missing variables. And Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, of course, knows more about this than anyone, I guess, of us. Is the issue of fractionalization and perhaps even I would say inequality and social justice. You didn't control for those in your narrative. So those are my maybe technical issues that I would like to raise. But the other issue maybe that I found surprising, when you wanted to account for human development, you chose the human capital index. So why not go for the non-income HDI? And that was a minor comment, but I thought was interesting. Now, your comment basically was that your main finding was that low income was the primary factor that triggered civil conflict, and it was low income and not necessarily democratic processes that were the most important factors in explaining violence. I think, of course, here we'd have to take, a little bit of more time to explain how and why these results took place. There is some evidence for this in the literature that democratic variables and voice itself may not necessarily be the most important explanatory variable of conflict. But I'm not sure that you can say that without having some dummies to control for different country experiences. Because I would say that in some country contexts, and especially in the Arab region, maybe this is not true. And again, this is an issue that speaks not just to the data, but our understanding of the dynamics of conflict. For example, for me, in reading and interpreting the Arab Spring, I would say that actually limitations on voice and accountability per se, and inequality issues, or maybe the World Bank would argue perceived inequality, played a very much of an important role in explaining conflict. Finally, I would like to have some remarks on Dr. Ibrahim's very interesting paper. All of the papers, I think, were really rich in terms of the empirical, quantitative, methodological, in the sense that they put an emphasis on this. But in Dr. Ibrahim's paper, I didn't really see the storyline developed in a convincing manner, because I personally have worked on Syria a lot, and I find that these particular conclusions, made from a historical point of view, and I'll leave Vlad to speak about the methodological issues, but these are controversial statements that you make, Dr. Ibrahim. Your results, basically, your argument is that the internal shock and the shock of liberal policies in particular were largely responsible for Syria's failure to transition to a knowledge-based economy and for the outbreak and development of the conflict. And I'm quoting from the paper. So conceptually, why would this happen in the Syrian case? Why would it be that the liberal policies? First of all, I would have, personally, having worked on Syria for a long time, and including in the period from 2002 to 2010, I was fortunate or unfortunate, depending on how you look at it, to be very close to the decision-making process of these liberal policies. And I can tell you, the arguments that we had then was, in fact, that between some groups like the World Bank groups, they were arguing that these policies were not liberal enough. And my position was, in fact, that they were trying to transition to a social market economy rather than a liberal economy. So again, the issue of the definition of what you mean by liberal policies, I think, is very important. And the other thing is that you make the statement that the implementation of these neoliberal programs and the resulting impact on the subsidies and food and fuel cuts have caused a lot of anger and riots and also the impact of droughts and all of that. I would also warn you from making that causal statement without taking into account, for example, that studies by UNDP and others, when they measured poverty in 2009 after these instability episodes, and including, by the way, the Iraqi refugees and the influx of more than 1.5 million, if I'm not mistaken, Iraqi refugees in the period of 2006, the poverty rate in Syria did not change that much, and the methodology for measuring poverty was more or less the same. So I find it very difficult to pin down so-called liberal policies as a causal factor in conflict in Syria prior to crisis. On the other hand, there are other factors, such as the ones discussed earlier, that have to deal with governance, they have to deal with equality, they have to deal with voice, and as you mentioned, the Arab Spring. But here, even in your analysis, you're separating between three kinds of shocks. There's the internal policy liberalization shock, there's the internal conflict shock, and then there's the external shock of the Arab Spring. And in fact, in my mind, the conflict, the internal and external ones are more or less the same. So for me, it's very blurry, the distinction between the second and the third shock, so to speak. So finally, you didn't discuss sanctions at all, and the impact the direct impact that sanctions have on knowledge, transition to a knowledge-based economy. And my question to you is, okay, so what would you have done differently as a Syrian decision maker post-conflict in terms of the economic policies? I mean, politics aside, given the very difficult limitations that you have and the firefighting, you have exchange rate problems here, you have internal conflict that hasn't, the degrees of freedom that you have as an economic decision maker in a conflict setting are really very limited indeed. So I will stop here, and I will turn the floor now to my colleague and friend, Dr. Vladimir, to perhaps discuss the methodological comments, and then we open the floor for questions and answers. I don't see any questions from the audience in the Q&A box, but I would like to remind anybody that if they want to speak, they can also ask for the floor. We can give the mic. So first, Dr. Vladimir, and then maybe before we go back to these other speakers and other questions, I would like to also give the floor to Dr. Ibrahim Badawi to hear his opinion. Vlad, this floor or the screen is yours.
Okay, thank you so much. I will try to be brief because I will Khalid has already provided the most important substantive comments, and I will just talk a little bit about some methodological issues that I saw as I read the papers. Or, these three papers are already very strong. They give very strong message. And I think just some small issues can be tied, some knots can be tied to make readers comfortable with the empirical analysis and to make this publishable in good economic or political economy journals. So first about the first paper, it's a great paper to read. I think it's a very bold paper. I think the paper has a lot of guts in the language it uses, and it's not a typical empirical economic paper to read, and for that reason I like it, that it stands out. So just in terms of tying some knots for to clean up the empirical analysis, I would say so the paper uses a well-established method already. I would say to justify this model, or to emphasize that this model is valid and strong, I would recommend putting in an appendix some additional specifications, so other dynamic panel data models to show robustness or the preference for this Arellano-Bond well-established method. Vector autoregressive models could also be attempted because there's some discussion in the paper about endogeneity, and there could be a concern about co-integration among variables. So the paper talks about endogeneity, but I think the endogeneity is not well defined. So a little bit more discussion could be or should be provided, and it might. And if the discussion leads to the identification of some specific substantive instrumental variables, the author should try them, because currently the identification relies on using lags of variables, and so it's a very mechanic source of identification, but I think given the the strength of the political economy message in the paper, if the author identified some political economy instruments, that could strengthen the overall feel of the article. Let me just some of the results of tests could be justified better. I personally felt that the results of tests were rather weak, or not the results, but the tests themselves were weak. And so either the author should justify why the tests are considered strong, or provide stronger results for validating the analysis, right? Because let's say the test relies on insignificance rather than significance of a particular coefficients, and so failure to reject is, I think, a common concern there. In terms of language, I really like the language, but I think in some instances the language could be made a little bit more specific. For example, the corrupt politicians do not lift a finger, I think could be could be written in specific terms. What exactly, what kinds of policymakers this is talking about, and what kind of policy approach would have been recommended than to what they actually took. Repelling multinational corporations sounds a bit kind of polemical, because it's not explained why multinational corporations should be to blame for particular issues. Democracy is a panacea. Again, it doesn't come out of the analysis, and it's a great prescription, but I think it should be motivated a bit more strongly and more specifically. Okay, I provide one or two references to papers that I'm pretty sure that the author is aware of, but it was not cited. And as I said, I think the language, the narrative that the author provides is the main strength of the paper. But sometimes some sentences can be hard to read. For example, this something like 15-line sentence in the paper could be possibly rewritten. So anyway, it was a pleasure to read this paper, and just some notes could be tied to make sure that empirically we're satisfied with all the results. The second paper, I'll quickly jump to that. Right, so it's my one concern was it's a multi-dimensional analysis. Various economic, social, and institutional factors were considered, but I felt that I had the unbalanced feeling that the variables were not equal to each other. They were not representative for the dimensions that they were set to represent. And it felt that some variables were selected because of the convenience of finding data rather than for their conceptual importance. So Khalid has already mentioned, why not control for inequality or poverty, ethnic fractionalization, and so on, which are suggested by conceptual literature. And some of them are easy to obtain data on. Then minor issues among the variables. Dependent variable is a flow. Some regressors are stocks. Some variables are kind of motivated or are aggregate level variables. Some regressors are motivated by micro level arguments. So I think the discussion could be, again, so these knots could be tied so that the discussion across dimensions is well balanced. Okay, sometimes the discussion suggests an interaction term between variables, and so that should be at least discussed. Why not? Why it wasn't used? Endogeneity and reverse causality issues. So like in the first paper, I think a little bit more discussion. A section should be provided on what kinds of endogeneity, what kinds of reverse causality could be problematic, and maybe several options of how they can be addressed. And the article actually uses an IV approach, but details of it, let's say first stage results, some more results, motivation for the IV approach should be provided. There is some sense of that the sample selection in the paper is biased. We selected 58 countries for which the index was about above 70 for the analysis. That's talking about the dependent variable, which raises an alarm and should at least be justified. Okay, IV results appear to be more significant than non-IV results, which again seems counterintuitive and should be explained how, because in most empirical analysis, it's the other way around. The IV approach can be more efficient, but can address endogenities, but it's costly in terms of standard errors. Whether the Poisson specification, so I like the use of the Poisson specification, but its use should be better justified, I believe, and maybe a comparison OLS model could be estimated to satisfy readers that not some outliers or some statistic of the data distributions give rise to the results. Okay, so for example, especially in regard to this Poisson specification, I think the authors should provide graphs to show the distribution that it is Poisson-like to justify the use of this method. Particularly concerning in Poisson models, so it should be discussed in more detail. So in general, more descriptives and estimation results could be provided because it's a very interesting, fascinating analysis, but it's a bit like a black box where we don't see the distribution of variables and we don't get a good sense of what the results are. The last paper, very quickly. So it's a one empirical analysis, and I would like to see again some robustness tests with alternative data. The dependent variable in this analysis is a simple average of 3 variables. The authors should explain better why this is the best specification. If not, then some alternatives could be tried: a geometric mean or a principal component analysis scores, or another approach of aggregating the 3 variables into one. I think some of the results and mechanics of the analysis were not completely clear to me. So at least for the sake of readers, the authors should explain. It seemed that the sample is quite small, of maybe 19 observations. In the prediction results of the propensity impacts, I see that the confidence intervals are quite large, always around 0. And so to the extent that I misunderstand something, the authors should at least preempt these kinds of concerns and explain whether the results are meaningful or how to interpret the wide interval confidence. Additional, and like in the previous paper, I would say providing more descriptive statistics and more results would make readers more comfortable with the analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Over to Khalid.
Thank you, Vlad. I think we were actually running out of time. We took a lot of time for comments, and I will not waste any more time. I would very much like to hand over to Dr. Ibrahim Badawi, and then we can, right after that, turn back to the speakers 3 or 4 minutes each for their final comments. Dr. Ibrahim, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid, and also for your comments, and also Dr. Vladimir, and of course the presenters. And at the ERF, we're excited actually that our researchers are embracing. Unfortunately, though, the development in the region associated with conflicts and the consequences of conflicts for development policy, including macroeconomic growth and so on. I actually, on view of the fact that the comments were really very good, and I don't have much to say, especially since, to be honest, I haven't had a chance to read the papers. I would like just to make a few remarks on Dr. Said's paper on the fragility and conflict. It's not clear to me what's the role of fragility here, because the dependent variable pertains to conflicts. And there are several definitions of fragility. All of them takes the inability of the state, of the sovereign, to take control of the exercise of organized violence. The failure of the state to do this is one of the basic aspects of fragility. So by construction, or by definition, a country that experiences conflicts is a fragile country, unless, and this is another problem for me, unless the terrorist action is there, which I think is there, and I'm quite surprised that the count, if I read the paper correctly, includes both terrorist action as well as large-scale violence in the form of civil wars, because civil wars are not necessarily terrorist actions. They are actually a challenge to the authority because of certain conditions, either lack of democracy or massive corruption, and so I think this is, at least the terrorism is different, defined different, and it responds to fundamentals that are different from civil wars. And large-scale violence in terms of civil war, theoretically and empirically, has been distinguished in the literature from terrorist action. So I'm surprised why this happens. The last point is about democracy, because there are a variety of approaches to measuring democracy. There is electoral democracy, there is egalitarian democracy, there is participatory democracy. And yesterday we had a very interesting paper on Tunisia, and the find also used, by the way, a Poisson regression, and the authors found that the gross spell is expanded. There is a positive and significant effect for participatory democracy and as well as egalitarian democracy, but there was no significant effect for electoral democracy relative to the baseline of an autocracy. And this is a very important result for Tunisia because it's a nascent democracy in the region, but it is not yet a participatory democracy or an egalitarian democracy. And so they are actually facing serious challenges regarding sustaining growth spell or even initiating growth. So I'm wondering whether this might actually be an important consideration before actually passing sweeping judgment against democracy in this particular paper. So I think this is basically the few points I wanted to raise. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. As usual, very insightful comments. And I wish we had more time to go into many of these issues. That it's a fascinating topic indeed. I'm also pleased that Dr. Nader Kabani is with us, and he would like to also have the floor for an intervention. So, Dr. Nader, if you are with us and you can take the mic. Maybe not. So maybe he's no longer with us. Okay, so if in order for us, since we only have 10 minutes to the end of the session, let me turn back to our speakers and give each of them perhaps 3 minutes to give us some quick reflections. And oh, hold on for a second. Could not take the mic. Is it possible then, if you can hear me, to put your comment, or maybe I don't know if the organizers can allow Dr. Nader to speak? If not, if you have a question, if you could type it, I would really appreciate it. I think while we're, I will let the speakers answer first. Okay, so Dr. Siham, 3 minutes, please, and then we turn to the second speaker, Dr. Sayed, and then we close with Dr. Ibrahim. Over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your insightful comments and constructive suggestions. Regarding the comment on the relationship between corruption and economic diversification, actually corruption induces unproductive rent-seeking behavior and encourages economic agents to focus on redistributive rather than value-adding activities. Actually, corrupt politicians and many minority exporters attempt to convey the perception that they are seeking the public good and governing in the public interest while doing their duties, but in fact they are making it impossible for these countries to become more economically diversified. And one of the most important issues is that governments of these countries directly decide how IRNs are allocated and what to spend and what to save of the oil money without showing a clear sense of fighting corruption or allowing citizens, the owners of oil well, to decide what to do with their rightful share of IRNs, for example. Returning the comment on Canada and Norway. Actually, early oil discoveries in Canada and Norway were preceded by an era of good governance and sound institutional base, while deeply rooted basis of poor governance, weak institutions, and lack of appropriate infrastructure greeted the first wave of oil exploitation in this region, where all successive governments did too little to promote democracy and legitimacy and fight corruption, but did everything they could to squeeze more revenues out of oil for fueling their the inefficient and excessive government spending and pursuing their narrow private interests at the expense of wider economic interests, structural transformation, economic diversification. Regarding the comment on the use of Canada and Norway as comparators, it can be said that those countries have been used as comparators because they are good examples of oil-rich countries that succeeded in turning their IRNs into a boon for long-term economic diversification. Due to good governance and very low levels of corruption. And this evidence supports the main idea and the overall argument of the paper. For example, Norway became a highly diversified and mature industrial economy by using oil discoveries to progress towards full economic diversification, and thanks to good governance and very low levels of corruption that preceded those oil discoveries, and forward-looking actions of the Norwegian government, strong institutions and checks and balances among the institutions of the state, and resulted the rule of law and integrity, of course. Similarly, Canada has succeeded in using its abundant oil wealth to realize its ambitious economic diversification programs, mainly due to supportive good governance and pre-existing strong institutional capacity, and of course, low levels of corruption. Returning on the comment on education, of course, a better education system can facilitate economic diversification. It can respond to the labor market demands for educated people. In fact, it is a powerful tool for enhancing human capital development, which in turn is an important driver of diversification success, because it is extremely pertinent in developing productive capacity and encouraging higher value added activities. And for example, successful pioneering Norwegian and Malaysian successful diversification experiences illustrate that better quality education is of a paramount importance when it comes to the success of a diversification strategy. And that's what MENA oil exporters in general and GCC countries in particular are lacking. For example, GCC countries have focused on...
Sorry, Dr. Seham, if I may ask you to conclude in a minute, because we're running out of time, I would very much appreciate it.
Okay. For example, GCC countries have focused on promoting the quality of higher education by collaborating with international universities, rather than focusing on enhancing skills and competencies that are highly required in the non-oil sectors that can pave the way for economic diversification. Regarding the comment on the use of the airline bond difference GMM estimator, the most important factor took into consideration in choosing this method is that it is very efficient in addressing the problems of endogeneity, because, for example, when first differentiating regressors, potential biases caused by omitted variables are removed, as these variables do not change over time. And of course, I use the Sargan-Hansen test of over-identifying restrictions, which examines the hypothesis of that, which indicates that our instruments are valid, and the Alana-Bond test of second-order serial correlation, which indicates that the error term is not serially correlated. So in both cases, the statistics are insignificant, and thus the null hypothesis cannot be rejected. And for the expressions, of course, I will remove them. And thank you so much,
Dr. Seham. I apologize, but we literally have 3 minutes, and even if we go on board, I think we can only expect to be a few minutes after the time allocated. Dr. Nader, I'm glad that you're now with us. If I can kindly ask you to give your comments in 2 minutes, if possible. I know it's tough, but I would much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Khalid. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for an excellent panel and moderation, and to Dr. Ibrahim Badawi for bringing in the issue of conflict to the ERF agenda. And you can see the great response from ERF affiliates. So I just want to, thanks very much to Dr. Seham and Dr. Sayed for excellent papers. I want to address my comments mostly to Dr. Ibrahim. First of all, I know, really, basically, I was very impressed that after many years of participating in ERF, I can't remember another paper that was being presented by Damascus University. And this is at a time when the country really is suffering a lot from economic shocks and devaluation of currency. And I know there's a lot of institutional pressure on researchers like Dr. Ibrahim, and to make time for this engagement is excellent. I guess my 2 points is that I hope he takes the comments that Dr. Khalid and Dr. Vladimir gave. They're both extremely important. It looks like the paper really is based on essentially 19 data points, and the degrees of freedom are fairly low, around 16. And to Dr. Khalid's point, there's a lot of interpretation being placed on essentially a dummy variable that is introduced at a specific point in time. and probably more so. So the internal shock is just, as far as I can understand, it's just a dummy variable, and then there's a lot of interpretation that's being placed on this. And I think the narrative needs to be very careful about really what the results mean. Even the couple of points where there's significance. My main point is to ask Dr. Ibrahim really to think about what he wants out of the paper as well. The motivation in the paper suggests that the knowledge economy is very important because manufacturing is not that big a deal in Syria. The Syria conflict and crisis saw all sectors of the economy devastated. The most devastated in big terms was the manufacturing sector, going from 22% of GDP before the conflict to 13% after the conflict. Agricultural essentially stayed the same because people need food and they need to eat. The service sector increased, largely driven by education and health, because essentially the government was pumping money into those, and they had to, because so basically public sector employment was keeping up the service sector. So manufacturing was a big part of the Syrian economy, and it needs to probably give an emphasis after the conflict. So post-conflict, agricultural is extremely important, putting food on the table. Bringing back manufacturing is extremely important, as well as redeveloping the service. So where does the knowledge economy fit into this? It's part of the equation, but I wouldn't say that it is. You can't discount the other sectors. And if the knowledge economy is part of the equation, and I think that's what your interest is, because that's what your profile suggests, then really thinking about what kind of argument it would take to create space for kind of a knowledge economy strategy is what you're after. And is this the right methodology to use, kind of time series regressions, or is it something that is a bit more along the lines of maybe knowledge production or knowledge consumption within the Syrian economy, and how that relates to growth, and collecting data along what's being produced in terms of knowledge and consumed in terms of knowledge? It takes your research agenda in terms of methodology in a slightly different direction, but I guess that's what I encourage you to think about as you develop your research agenda. What are the questions you want to ask? What are the outcomes you want in terms of policy engagement? And then what is the best way to communicate those results? I think the current paper puts a lot of it puts more load on your questions than the methodology is capable of answering. So that's why I raised that issue. And thank you for giving me the floor, Dr. Khalid, much appreciated.
Thank you, Dr. Nader. No, I think these are very pertinent comments, and I wish I had more time to give more comments and ask another question, which is, exactly that. When you are squeezed on policies and you have the sanctions, you have so many difficult conditions. In fact, what kind of policies then are available for you to promote indigenous knowledge creation? And especially that you have, the internet, you can do that. And there are examples even from neighboring countries where the sanctions did produce an input substitution effect. Of course, the conditions in Iran are different, but there are arguments that it can be done. So these are all very interesting questions. I wish we had time to discuss them further. We don't. So I will turn to speakers, Dr. Sayed, also asking him for very brief, if possible, a minute and a half, dashing through comments, and then finally Dr. Ibrahim. Much appreciated, and apologies beforehand for making this request.
Thank you very much for your insightful comments and suggestions. I will be very brief.
But Dr. Sayed, if you could speak closer to the mic, please.
Sorry, I'm so sorry.
Yes, this is
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
okay.
Now go ahead.
So for the comments, for frequency and intensity, there's a different literature on intensity and the decrease in number of conflicts. So, but I will try to use number of people killed and wounded also. For many variables, we cannot use, for example, ethnic fractionalization or economic inequality, because our panel, they consist of the fragile countries, and the data is not available for many countries. For non-income HDI, we use the human capital from the HDI, but we will also include for example, mortality rate or stuff like that. And we will also try to use voice and accountability as a for robustness. For the other comments, we took panel for countries with more than one religion to see if the determinants have different signs. So for the convenience in selecting variables, we use different variables too, for example law and order and other variables, but we did not mention here because of the space limitation. And for example, for introducing, we use like efficient judiciary to introduce a new variable in the literature. And so that's why we show the results for efficient judiciary only from the doing business. We'll also show some graphs to show if the Poisson specification is a better statistical tool to use here. But we also use like the other methods to regress for count data, for example negative binomial and zero inflated negative binomial and zero inflated Poisson regression, and they had the same results. And for the last comments, we took fragile countries to understand the determinants of conflict only in the fragile countries. So because for us they were more important, and we took terrorism based incidents to proxy for conflict. We did not take like the civil conflict or the long-term armed conflict, for example dummy variables for that. We just took the number of incidents, terrorism based incident as a proxy for conflict. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And last but not by any means least, Dr. Ibrahim, 2 minutes to close.
Thank you all colleagues for your thorough and useful comments, and I will take all of them in consideration. Regarding what you requested, Dr. Khalid, what I would do in terms of liberal policy, I would make more deliberate economic transformation policy by making a more realistic analysis of the type of liberal policy that we need and that have to be taken and their potential impact on different geographical areas. Also, I would avoid radical liberal policy directed toward the agricultural sector as the largest contributor to GDP. Actually, in Syria, there was many consequences of ill-considered liberal policies in general, such as reducing fuel and fertilizer subsidies. For example, especially in the eastern regions, where it leads to internal migration that negatively affected the agricultural sector. This situation had social and economic consequences, as the migration of the eastern population to the major cities led to the ruralization of the cities and made the infrastructure in a bad situation, as well as led to a weak level of basic services and especially ICT services, which are an essential element and factor in building and transforming toward a knowledge-based economy. In my opinion, the Syrian society and economy weren't sufficiently prepared for this kind of unstable liberal policy. So our problem was not about, I agree with you that we didn't have a liberal policy. So we had a problem in planning and in putting our policy in implementation. Regarding what type of policy that we need, actually, me and my colleague, Professor Suleiman, we published 3 articles about building and transition toward knowledge-based economy in Syria. And we see that we need a policy at the level of institution regulating the process of knowledge creation or production and commercialization of this knowledge. Until today, we don't have an intellectual property protection system in Syria, effective system. So this is the incentive for creating a new knowledge and innovations doesn't exist now. Also, we need policy at the level of building innovative capabilities by adopting the reconstruction policy to contribute and build in process of building a knowledge-based economy in the future. For example, we need foresight studies of a specific activity, economic activities such as programming in Syria. Now we have outsourcing activities in this field that would be an initial step in the way of building economic activity based on intensive knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to all the speakers. And I would like to, of course, thank the ERF for giving us this wonderful opportunity to interact on a very interesting and very controversial subject. We will never agree on what drives conflict. The theory of why nations fail, I think, is hotly contested at a global level. Asimoglu and Robertson's hypothesis is still a subject of very intense debate. Even at the country context, we will disagree. Narratives, the way we see the world, and what are the most important variables driving conflicts. Was it liberalization? Was it immigration? Was it the drought? Were there poor institutions? All of that. But one thing I think is for sure that connects all of these narratives, and I think Dr. Ibrahim mentioned that, is that the control of the state on violence and how it's lost, and the narrative of the sovereignty. I think that is the crucial issue. And I think in many cases in the Arab region, this issue of sovereignty and the issue of control of violence, I think it needs to be more thoroughly investigated, because in many countries, even in countries that are apparently stable and maybe classified, as without having much incidents of violence, whether domestic violence or whether terrorist incidents, may not have really full sovereignty on all their geographic territories. And this is a stylized fact, I think, that is becoming more apparent in many countries in the region. It is something that I think we should pay more attention to in the future. But again, wonderful discussion. I would like to thank everybody. And before we close, I think maybe turn to Dr. Shireen for any final words from her side. Thank you all very much, and looking forward to being with the ERF events in the future. Dr. Shireen, over to you.
Thanks ever so much, Dr. Khalid, and thanks to each and every one of the speakers. It's been a fantastic session. And again, on the topic that's very close to Dr. Ibrahim's heart, I just want to confirm that the session has been actually broadcasted live on the YouTube channel. And all the material is available online immediately following the session. You'll be hearing shortly from Huda to arrange with you the timing with regards to when you can provide us with the revised papers in light of the discussants' comments. And we'll be then posting those online. And I'd like to take the opportunity to actually also invite the speakers to consider an article for the forum to ensure further outreach. And it would be extremely ideal if we can time it in such a way that the forum article goes out together with the working paper for maximum impact. And again, thank you very much for a fantastic session. Tomorrow, we have our third session that's related to our theme of conflict and political economy. So I invite you to join us. Dr. Bilal Falah is going to be moderating the session, and we're going to have 3 very interesting papers to do with the Arab Spring, a new dividing line, to look into some unconditional cash-based assistance to the poor. What do at-scale programs achieve? And finally, on the gender gap in the political participation, evidence from the MENA region. And then I'd like to also ask you to mark your calendar for next Thursday for our very special panel on the ERF project, on the conflict, to hear directly from Dr. Ibrahim Badawi on that project, together with Dr. Samir Maqdisi and Raimondo Soto. And then it's going to be a very long and rich session, because it's going to be addressing the aftershock of the Arab uprising, reconstruction, national peace and democratic change in the first cluster of the session, and then followed by foundations for post-conflict growth agenda in the MENA region. And you're going to have Dr. Khalid Abu Ismail with us, with Dr. Samih Touman. And then another section on impact of violent conflict on lives and livelihood in the MENA region with Dr. Tilman Brook and Dr. Nada Mustafa Ali. And then finally, the economic interdependency and conflict with Dr. Ahmed Ghonim and Dr. Ibrahim Saif. So with that, I thank you again and thank all the panelists and Dr. Khalid Abu Ismail and Dr. Vladimir for an excellent moderation. Most grateful. Back to you,
I'd like
Khalid.
to thank
Dr. Ibrahim.
Khalid. I would also like to thank Khalid and Vladimir and our presenters, and I think these are all I think related to the big project that that we initiated, a thematic project, and as I said, unfortunately, also responding to the phenomena that impacted our region, and many countries are actually are still in conflict or ripe for conflict, unfortunately. So it's very important for us as scholars, you know, to actually take interest on conflict and how it affects development policy and the livelihood and stability of our countries. So thank you very much. Looking forward to see you again in future plenaries and sessions.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. Thank you, Dr. Shireen. Thank you, everybody. It's been our pleasure, and we also look forward to being with you in the future events and the ones coming soon in the next few days. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure. Goodbye.
Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
Goodbye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.